literary tradition called Malaysian Literature in English. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through. Halfway through, I'll stop if you've got any questions. So we've got two central focus with this lecture. If you've got your slides open, please do have it on hand. So if you've got questions, you can kind of ask me. All right. So there's 27 slides. Just let's pace ourselves. We will stop halfway when we'll stop around slide 14 when we discuss author-defined social reality. That's the key to our entire course. All right, this is a term that I coined during my PhD thesis. I borrowed from Professor Shamsul Amri Baharudin's authority-defined social reality and everyday defined social reality. And I felt that as Malaysian authors themselves have their own author-defined social reality. So that's the central focus of our course. What is the Malaysian author social reality, and how does that social reality gets represented in the form of fiction narratives? So we'll stop around slide 14, okay? So let's go straight into it. So we're looking at the canon of Malaysian literature in English. An overview, we're looking at the evolution of Malaysian literature in English. We're looking at, when we think about the evolution of Malaysian literature in English, we need to kind of take it back to pre-independence. We're looking at, also in this lecture, we're looking at writers and the society that they write. And then, as I said, we're looking at authorial-defined or author-defined social reality. And finally, looking at the reader's task. As readers, what is your task? You know, the writer has their own task. To define their social reality in the narrative. What about the reader? What's our task? And then I'll give you a tutorial task for next week. So in terms of origin, if you like, it is rooted very much amongst university students in the late 1940s in the Singapore campus, you know, the King Edward's Medical College in Singapore, the literary and debating society. So if you like, the writers that were emerging in the 1940s were university students who were studying literary works by English writers, and they themselves began to emulate, experimented with their own poetry and their own writings, and published in a literary journal called The Cauldron, okay, the first published in English, in Malaya and Singapore by quote-unquote locals, right? Locals meaning the Malayan folk themselves. But because there wasn't a nation state, we were very much then part of the British Empire. And these writers who presented a more imitative technique of writing, they emulated very much the Western canon. Okay, so that's the origin of MLE. So if you look at it, 1940s, Malaya was not even, hasn't even received independence. 1940s, very quick history quiz, pop quiz. What was happening in Malaya in the 1940s? Anybody know?
Malayan Union.
Okay, before that?
Nationalist movement.
Before that? That's good. But before that? When was World War II?
Early 40s for about 3 years or so.
Japanese occupation, was it?
Japanese occupation, World War II. Following that, we had Japanese occupation. Then we had Malayan Union and all the other things came up, right? So that's something to always keep in mind in terms of context. Why? Because Malaysian writers, one of the historical backdrop that they like to come back to is the Japanese occupation. You will see that in The Garden of Evening Mist. So historical context is super crucial. So the 1930s and 40s, post World War One, these are the things that was happening, as I said, the literary tradition, right? And then following that, World War Two, there was no marked production of literature being produced. But following World War II, after the Japanese left Malaya, they left a lot of these. The traces of their presence were a historical, psychological, and emotional scar that kind of left an impression in the minds and hearts of the people of Malaya. And the writers who came afterwards, these are the writers who came afterwards, they use the war period as a kind of an important character in the storytelling of their narratives. Even Tan Kuan Yin, who's in the 21st century, emulated this aspect. So the World War II, as you know, as scholars have problematized, left a very significant impact in the hearts and minds, especially in race relations in Malaya. It kind of like implanted seeds of distrust amongst the Malays and the Chinese, especially because the Chinese were badly treated by the Japanese because of the war between China and Japan. So the Japanese came here and they abused the Chinese in Malaya. And in the novel The Garden of the Evening Mist, as you will be reading, the central character is a Chinese woman who experiences that kind of physical and emotional and psychological trauma in the hands of the Japanese soldiers. So that kind of created a distrust, because certain members of society then, certain groups of Malayans were not as badly treated as others, right? And another aspect of World War II that came up was, as Ruby pointed out, this nationalist championing for a nationalist cause. The seeds of nationalism were planted then when the Malayan folks themselves felt, hang on a minute, the British are not as powerful as we thought, because another Eastern empire came and chased them out, and the Japanese took over for a few years in Malaya. That shows that the British were not as strong as the Malayan folk thought they were. So if the Japanese can do that, why can't we? Why can't we take over this land and rule our own land? So the seeds of nationalism were planted largely due to World War II and the effects of World War II. And then, of course, another historical backdrop that we need to keep in mind, with the Japanese surrendering and the British coming back, it didn't stop there. The communist insurgent in Malaya kind of like stayed on for the longest time, where the communists wanted to take ownership of this land and kind of rule the land. And they did this in a very guerrilla warfare manner. In The Garden of Evening Mist, this is also an important character of the story, an important feature of the story. Other novels that also problematize the state of emergency, where Malaya was placed under emergency because of the communist attacks. And the ruling authorities used the emergency as a way to manage, to mitigate the problems faced with the communists. Novels that kind of captured that include The Silent Army and The Grand Illusion. Very quickly, I want to kind of give you some of the names of our established Malaysian literature and English writers. The canon is made up of writers from the 20th century, as well as the more emerging writers of the 21st century. The 20th century writers, you have poets like E. Tiang Hong, Edward Doral, you have poets like Wang Pui Nam, you have a prose writer like Lee Kok Liang, Lloyd Fernando, poets like Muhammad Haji Saleh, Omar Muhammad Noor, poets, short story writer, novelist, diasporic writer, Shirley Lim. You have novelist, playwright, short story writer, K.S. Maniam, and essays as well. You have another diasporic writer, poet, Hilary Tam. You have the poet Cecil Rajendran. You have the playwright, essayist Keith Wan Chai. You have the poet, prose writer, essays Saleh bin Jonid. So these are some of the names of the first and second generation writers of Malaysian literature in English canon. What were some of the issues? So timeline, Malaya received its independence in 1957. In 1963, Malaya was formed, where Peninsular Malaya and Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore came into it. And then 65, Singapore left to form its own independent nation. Then 1969, Malaysia experienced its first race tension. There was a bloody clash in 1969, 13th May 1969, following the general election in which the opposition won a slightly higher majority compared to the ruling authority. And people started to kind of demonstrate, and there was a clash between the Malays and the Chinese. It was one of the worst experiences in the Malaysian history, where people died. There was a kind of a clash between Malaysians themselves due to their own dissatisfaction with the results and all the rest of that. Following that, the government redefined the certain policies, the National Language Act, the National Cultural Act, that used language as a form to build a more homogeneous sense of identity, nation-state identity. And these policies had a repercussion on the Malaysian landscape collectively, as well as the Malaysian writings specifically. So as I said, Malaysian writings that were written the Malaysian writings written in other languages besides Malay were positioned in the sectional or vernacular category. And these writers, Lloyd Fernando, K.S. Maniam, Lee Kok Leang, they were all prolific in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But none of these writings were considered a national literature. They were not in the national literature canon. So the kind of issues that they problematize in their writing include social unrest, distrust, dissatisfaction, which creates tension amongst people. They also cover issue of race relation, cultural diversity. So every one of these novels, Fernando's 2 novels, Scorpion Orchid and Green is the Color, K.S. Maniam's 3 novels, The Return in a Far Country and Between Lives, and Lee Kok Leang's Flowers in the Sky especially, these novels primarily deal with race relations as a central character in the story, right? You have to understand that race relations in Malaya at that time, in Malaysia as well, this was in Malaya. The 3 novels set in Malaya. The others were in Malaysia. Race is an important feature of the landscape. How one race or one ethnic community deals with another is an important aspect of the story that is Malaysian history and Malaysian sociology. Then these writers merely replicated that in their novels. So that's part of the themes of the text. Then 1990s onwards, we had the Wawasan 2020. We had this policy of looking at Malaysia from the eyes of the global development. So English began to have more emphasis in the school syllabus. So we had the revival of Malaysian literature in English following that, with new works by writers because of platforms being made available, such as writing competitions, the NST Shell writing competitions. We had publishing houses promoting individual publications. We had publishing houses being formed, like Silverfish and so on. So, that kind of helped the writers reevaluate their concerns. They were asking, beyond the race relations, they were asking questions like, is the language of choice important? Does it matter if it's English or Malay? What about the conflicts, the social political conflicts in the country? How is that seen in fiction? Who represents the nation? Is it an individual? Is it an ethnic community? Who best, where is your sense of identity, and what is that identity based on? Is that based on your individual identity, your individual marker? Is it based on your ethnic community, or is it based on your sense of nation and nationhood and national pride? So the kind of things that we were talking about earlier with regards to writers who live away from Malaysia but write about Malaysia, you may see that also in Malaysian writers of the late 20th century. They were also problematizing that. And they were also problematizing the issue of marginalization, how they felt marginalized because their writing was not considered as an important contribution to the national canon of Malaysian writing. And this is also because they're not getting any official support. There is no government funded programs for these writers. There is no central organizing body that promotes their writing. For instance, like Malay literature, they have Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. English literature doesn't have that. Malaysian writers in English, they don't have that kind of an institutionalized body that promotes their works, so much so that it's like they are completely left on their own. So because of that, by the end of the 20th century, some of the challenges that the writers face include, asking questions like, who do we represent? What do we write about? And how do we express these thoughts? And even, is writing it necessary? Is it necessary? Because if no one's going to value our works and consider it as a Malaysian writing, is there value in it? So a lot of these writers were disenfranchised by the situation of the time towards the end of the 20th century. So I'm just going to pause there before we go into this other section called author-defined social reality. So far, any questions? Any questions?
I'm following all right out there.
Okay, cool. Salim, are you okay so far?
Yes, exactly. But I think there is a little bit difference between, the literature in Malaysia at that time, because we went through the same period of occupation, of two period of occupation. The first one was by British, and the second one was by American. So I can feel that the context is a little bit different.
But you can understand how the historical context is an important context in the reading of the literature, because it's the same with Iraq. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Good. Anyone else? Any questions? Any comments? Any reflections?
No, I just wanted to just had something interesting when Dr. Rai mentioned about the founding members, right, of Malaysian writing in English were based in Singapore. So the University Malaya was then in Singapore. So the writers even like Adiba Amin, right, was from there. And I think with Wang Gungwu, I think, right, at one point there was this effort to kind of bring together this if Dr. Wright, you remember the Ing Mal Chin. So it was an effort to kind of try to come up with this language that would combine English, Malay, and Chinese and Tamil as well, I think. But and in the form of was it also incorporated in the cauldron? I can't remember, but it didn't quite take off. But that was something that they tried to do. So, yeah, but it just lasted for a bit. But it's maybe something just to remember that the mindset of those people who gathered, right, was very much to try and bring everyone together for inclusivity. So the effort to kind of even come up with this artificial language was mooted by that particular group or the first generation as well. I mean, this was something I always found like a very funny thing. It was very interesting. Just thought I'll add that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because that's the issue of domestication. When we think about how Malaysian writers, what were some of the efforts that they made to make English more palatable to this land, to the people of this land, to, maybe there are expressions in Malay that when you try to translate it into English, somehow it just goes missing, right? And vice versa. Maybe there are some words in English that you want to say it in Malay, or you want to try to convey the idea in Malay, and you're like, no, I don't have something equivalent. So what do the writers do if they want to express certain things? So you will notice in both novels, The Return as well as Garden of Evening Mist, the writers code switch. They literally use the original language. They use either Tamil in The Return or in the Garden of Evening Mist, Malay, Chinese. You have even the African language. So it captures that kind of the landscape, because that's what Malaya and Malaysia was like, right? So Dr. Mel's point is valid, because when we think about how Malaysian writer, they don't want to emulate, they don't want to copy, they don't want to replicate writers from the West, the British writers, the American writers, but yet they're writing in English. How do they make that English more localized? Right?
I think the acceptance of the hybridity as well, right?
Yeah.
That it's okay that you're not pure,
Yeah. So that's something that linguists and applied linguists will call nativization of the English language. So writers in Africa have done the same thing. Writers like Ngugi Watiango, Chenwa Achebe, they too have nativized the English language to the African context before they decided to write purely in their own native language. Yeah. So these are some things that writers consciously make the effort. That's part of their author-defined social reality. So I'm going to proceed with the second half of our lecture on that note. Looking at author-defined social reality. Okay, so as I said, this is a key construct throughout our course, throughout the semester. If you like, the icon that I put there is the thumbprint, right? So that's the kind of the signature, if you like, what the writer thinks of the country, how the writer views the country. That's what is seen in his writing, in her writing, and that is the author-defined social reality that we need to acknowledge. That means if a writer, for instance, represents a country predominantly from a particular community's perspective, right? Which is what Maniam has been criticized for. If he writes from a particularly monocultural perspective, like his Malay counterparts, like Shannon Ahmad, like Samad Said, who write from a particular monocultural perspective, Samad Said, Shannon Ahmad from a Malay perspective, K.S. Maniam from an Indian perspective, does that mean that author's social reality is not Malaysian? So that's an issue that was debated extensively in the 20th century. So that's what I mean by race. Race relations was an important character in all the stories. You cannot read a Malaysian story and not realize that they are in fact problematizing race relations in the country. Okay, so where did this idea of author-defined social reality came from? Picking up Shamsul Amri Baharuddin's article where he problematized the two constructs. Prof. Shamsul is an anthropologist, sociologist. He's a professor Ulong in UKM. I'm sure you are familiar with him. I will make sure this article is also made available to you. It's a very short but dense article. But the bit that I took from the article are these two constructs: the everyday defined social reality, which is, as Professor Shamsul defines it, and I quote, identity experienced or lived out by the people in their daily life. So what does that mean? It's people on the streets and how they articulate their individual experience. Do they live in a monocultural setting? Are they multicultural? Do they engage with people from other races? Do they speak only their own language? Do they speak other languages? Do they practice only their cultural sensibilities, or do they also practice other cultures? For instance, if it's Chinese New Year, do you kind of go visit your neighbors who are Chinese? Do you wish them Gong Xi Fat Chai? All those kinds of things. That's part of the individual's everyday experience, which differs from one part of the country to another. If you're in Penang, it will be different from you're in Besut, Terengganu. It will be different if you are also in in a Felda's estate, right? So your experience as a member of this nation, your everyday experience as a member of nation is colored by your surrounding, by what's happening around you. So that experience is lived out by you according to your context. Okay. Another component of everyday social reality is the popular forms of expression in popular culture. However, I felt that the Malaysian author does not just represent the everyday defined social reality. They too have a kind of a public persona that they represent. And that public persona does not get covered in this construct called everyday defined social reality. So that's why I felt everyday defined social reality was not encapsulating enough for the Malaysian authors. Authority-defined social reality is the other construct that Prof. Shamsul defines, which is identity formation that is defined by authorities or, quote-unquote, the dominant power structure, right? And they're designed systematically and they're recorded in a form of a discourse, maybe policy, the acts, and they are then carried out by the members of society. So between everyday defined social reality and authority defined social reality, where does the Malaysian writer situate his or her social reality? So that's why I felt the author too has a kind of a social reality. That is the third variation. The author defined social reality is the identity formation that is based on the literary representation of Malaysian authors. That was my proposal in my PhD. And I felt that every Malaysian writer, as you will discover in this course, every Malaysian writer has his or her own social reality. K.S. Maniam's social reality will differ from Cik Husna's social reality, will differ from Muhammad Haji Saleh's social reality, will differ from Tan Tuan Eng's social reality. But they all represent a facet of Malaysian writers' social reality, right? They have both the public persona because their voice is followed or read by others, but they also capture the everyday experiences of the people in their stories. Then that comes down to the reader. What's your task as a reader? If the writer represents the country and the landscape and the people and their concerns based on the author-defined social reality, what about you as the reader? What is your task? So my suggestion is, as Malaysian writers present the country in a particular light, represent the conflicts and the issues, the readers, be it Malaysian or non-Malaysian, we need to read the Malaysian stories and consider certain issues. Number one, ask yourself, how does the text deal with the issue of social, cultural, political, gender, religious, class, linguistic diversity in this multicultural nation? Keeping in mind, a writer cannot capture every aspect of the diversity of the land. Maybe the writer wants to capture the political diversity, or maybe another writer wants to capture, Lee Kok Leang's Flowers in the Sky captures the religious diversity of Malaya during colonial times, with the coming of the priests from China, setting up, the temples in Penang in Malaya. So that story captured that aspect, both the Hindu temple and the Buddhist temple and the Goddess of Mercy temple. So they had that kind of religious diversity. With Tan Tuan Eng, you have both the historical diversity, the cultural diversity, but also class-based diversity. So that's the first thing to ask yourself, how does the text deal with the context of the country and what context is being dealt with? The second question to ask is, does the writer challenge any idea of representation in his or her story? Is the writer challenging race relations in the country? Is the writer challenging the formation of Malaya? Is the writer challenging the sense of Malaysian identity, what it means to be a Malaysian? What aspect of Malaysian history is being challenged by the writer? So that's the second thing you want to ask when you're reading a text by Malaysian writers. The third and final question that you want to kind of also be asking as you're reading a Malaysian text is, do you feel the text represents or reflect your version of Malaysia? And that version of Malaysia is today. And the reading that you're doing is of a text that is set maybe in another context, another time frame. Does that text still echo the concern of Malaysia today? So that's something you need to do throughout the semester, in this particular course. Always engage with the text. Always ask yourself, what is the context that the writer is representing? What is the context that the writer seems to challenge? And how does this story represent my version of Malaysia today? Okay, I'm going to stop again for quick feedback. Any questions?
Yes, Doctor. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Thank you so much. Doctor, my question to you is, do writers, let me talk about the context in Malaysia, do writers today are discussing or talking about the topics in their writings just like as before, or the topics on their writings has been, for example, different from what they were at that time and nowadays? Because in my context in Iraq, most of the novels at the time of occupation were different topics. Now people are starting to get bored of things have to do with the blood, with the death, so they try to change another trend of their. Now if you go to the market, then you will find lots of literary works, but they are different from what they have been written before. Now they are talking about social issues such as love or career problems faced by young people. And if you come back to if you go back to the writings of that time, entirely different works, entirely different topics, entirely different contexts, and even the language. Now the language of today, or let's say the current language that or most of the writers are using nowadays is different from the language that has been used before. Now today they are concentrating more or most of the modern language on the modern linguistic phrases and even more modern words. They are trying to imitate English words. Now, if you in my context in Iraq, especially in the north of Iraq, now writers are emphasizing on new words which are trying to be more English. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Thank you, Salim. Good observation. I like the fact that you're constantly reflecting based on your own context. I think that's the best way to get the best of this particular course because it is set in a particular context, right? Malaysia. So I think those are the kind of questions we want to ask as well. So next week you will be reading the first novel set in a particular context. Then following that, you're going to read something else and then something else. So you will see how the writer how each writer represents one aspect of the country's development, historical development, social development, and the changes that's happening in the country. Perhaps you won't be able to sense that because you're away. Because if you're living in this country and you're experiencing the country every day, but you're reading something else that is being represented about the country, you will see the difference. You will see the difference very clearly. And where we are, UKM, where we are, it's located in a particular place geographically in the country, but the writers may be writing about another geographical setting of the country, of Malaysia. And you will see a kind of a difference. So geographical movement is also an apparent character in the way stories are told. I'm sure it's the same with the Iraqi context. So if a particular text is written closer to the Kurds borders, the stories will be different. If it is written closer to the capital, Baghdad, it will be different. So likewise, but good question. And I think I want you to constantly ask this, especially when we come to reading the actual novels.
Inshallah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments, feedback, questions?
If I can just say something, Doctor.
Mhm.
I think that term that you propose, author-defined social reality, I find that very fascinating because I believe that literature is a reflection of history, a reflection of the people. But I guess as students, we are supposed to try and map out different aspects of what makes Malaysia Malaysia. So I guess hopefully we are able to actually locate different literature, and different texts and put them together. But I wonder, are there any parts of our society that is not represented in Malaysian literature? But that is just me being curious.
Yeah, I think that's where you as readers in your final project, you get to propose. You may look at the literature review of literature on Malaysian literature in English. You may say that, okay, a lot of studies have been done on gender, on race, on national integration, on language, the diversity of language in Malaysia, and all the rest of it. But nothing has been done on I don't know, on whatever, maybe the emotion.
One example I can give is, for example, these issues of new communities and the migrant communities, right? So
Okay.
there was, I remember reading an anthology written by a former police officer based in Penang, where he actually gives the story is told from the perspective of
Refugees.
yes, I think Myanmar, who travels through Thailand and then is put to work in Penang, and how he turns to a life of crime by the virtue of the realities that he experienced as being marginalized in this country. So that's written by a Malaysian though. But then there's also, so this is something that we also do in Malaysian narration. There's also an annual competition of poetry writing for the migrants that's organized every year, right? So, but of course, again, these writers are not Malaysians, but they are writing from the perspective of their lived experience
In Malaysia.
In Malaysia. And there's a very beautiful poem called Bird, written by a Bangladeshi writer, or well, Bangladeshi migrant worker here. So
Hmm.
I'm not sure how do we fit that into your final project, if that's something that you want to explore
Hmm.
in terms of the realities in Malaysia, but not necessarily written by Malaysians themselves.
Yeah, but taking out Dr. Mel's suggestion, maybe, and I'm sure this is the case in many instances, maybe these quote unquote migrants marry local women or marry with marry into the Malaysian landscape through come into the Malaysian landscape through marriage. Their children may also have a different kind of story, and that could be a third community that we have not explored, right? And their social reality will be marked, will be different from how the other Malaysian writers are also representing
Like the
Malaysia.
third culture kids, right?
Very much the
Yeah.
third culture kid syndrome. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Aimee, Elia, Lisa, are you all following us so far? The reason I'm having to stop, I'm not having to. I like that I'm stopping to just kind of check up on you, is because we're doing this online, and it's difficult to gauge whether or not you're following me because I can't read your body language, I can't see your faces. So you need to let me know if you feel this is slightly overwhelming, it's just too much. But at the end of the day, the work that you will be producing is a reflection of your interest, right? It's a reflection of what you are interested in with regards to this canon called Malaysian Literature in English. Okay, so if you've got any comments, any concerns, please feel free to raise them in class.
Okay, doctor.
Aimee, okay so far?
Yeah, so far I'm okay, doctor.
Okay. Just to kind of break the ice a little bit, lah, joke a bit. My sister-in-law was telling me she's got 3 kids. My brother has 3 kids, and they range from college student, secondary school, high school, and primary. And they are all in their rooms studying, of course, because it's right now online. And my sister-in-law was telling me they sometimes they switch off the camera and they're sleeping during class. And I'm looking at my nieces and my nephew, I'm like, you cannot do that. And they're like, never mind, auntie, they've got it recorded, we can always listen to the recording. I'm like, oh my god, so I hope those who've not got their cameras on, y'all are not dozing off whilst I'm going on and on and on. I hope you're following the discussion. So please let me know if this is too much, if you want me to kind of explain myself in any aspect, because like I said, if you get what I'm trying to do the first 10 weeks, the next 4 weeks will be fun for you because you get to partake in that conversation as a scholar, as a researcher. So please let me know if you've got trouble following along. Okay, the last part of our lecture for today. Okay, sorry. The last part of our discussion. I'm going to do a case study of 3 Malaysian writers, and I'm going to ask you to read each excerpt. And when you read each excerpt, ask yourself, what is this writer's social reality based on? So you've got 3 writers. The first is a poet, the Malaysian National Laureate, Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh. The second is the second Maniam, or the second is K.S. Maniam, the writer that you will be studying the next couple of weeks. And the third is another novelist, Lloyd Fernando. So all 3 writers, they have their own, their own statement, if you like, with regards to their craft, with regards to their literary production. With Muhammad Haji Saleh, his is poetry, obviously. So, have a quick read. I'm going to give you 1 minute to just read through this and ask yourself, what is his author-defined social reality based on? Okay, can I get Aimee? Can you read it for me?
From the top, Doctor?
Yeah, this page. Can you see?
Yes.
All right.
The traditional concept of the Malaysian poet is that he is a member of society, even an elder, writing for that society. He has a function and sometimes a mission. So it is not a free for all and a no host bar affair. In such a situation, one does not try to talk too much of oneself as there are more important things to talk about. There are limits to the individual's ability to continually interest. True, in the earlier years, I wallowed in my problems and used them as my subject matter, but after some time, the self can be pretty boring. The world outside is more various, more interesting, and as one grows older, one distances oneself from the self and merges into society.
Thank you very much. So, what does the author say about number one, his approach to writing, number two, his function as a writer, and also about himself? Whatever you can catch from this quotation, do share with us.
I feel like he emphasized on the importance of locating ourselves in the society that we belong to, instead of just say being so withdrawn. So a poet or a writer must always mingle, for the lack of a better word, yeah, like in the society to be able to move and then perhaps write about it and hopefully represent it.
Okay, good. So locating the self within a kind of a community. Good. What else?
Sorry, doctor.
Yes, Salim.
He is one of the member of the society. He is not away from the society. He is one of the people who belong to the society. Whatever he is writing is belong to the society and not from another society. So he's considered himself as a one as they say stone in this big world. Thank you.
So his sense of identity and his sense of belonging is very clear.
Yes,
Yeah?
doctor.
Okay, good. Next. Anything else that you all can see?
Uh, I think lah, from what I'm getting, he's saying that his own experience is very limited, and to talk about himself could get pretty boring, which is why he encourages us to see more of the outside world. I think that's what it is. We can only talk about ourselves and our problems and what we know, all for very limited, right? And to experience more of the outside world, we have to meet and see other people and mingle with the society.
So that's the line that stood out for you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So these are the lines that stood out for me when I saw this quote. These are the lines or phrases that stood out for me. The idea of traditional concept. So tradition is key to the way Muhammad Haji Saleh foresees the Malaysian poet. The idea of tradition, the idea of being a member of a society, the idea of being an elder, writing for the society, not writing for yourself, but writing for the society. So that sense of functionality and mission. So these are key roles, if you like. You know, if the writer foresees himself in this light, you expect to see those kinds of things in his work of art, right? So if this is his statement, if this is what he says he is, this is his declaration, if you like, of who he is as a poet, as an author, right? You expect to see that in his work. So when you are reading Muhammad Haji Saleh Si Tenggang's Homecoming, the poem, look out for these elements. That's what I'm saying. So this is part of the context. This is the biographical context that helps you understand the writer's works better. So for every text that you are reading, K.S. Maniam, Tan Tuan Eng later, and all the others, and your own your own final project, look out for such statements by the writer himself or herself about his or her author-defined social reality. How does the author, the Malaysian author specifically, how does he, what is his sense of identity as a writer based on? What is it based on? Is it based on his culture? Is it based on his tradition? Is it based on his perception of what a writer ought to be like, right? So that's the thing that I wanted to kind of focus on with regards to Muhammad Haji Saleh's statement. Anybody else has any final thoughts about this quote? So the idea of the I is not as important as the we, if you like. Okay, so the unsaid, the silence or the unsaid, so we talked about his approach to writing, function as a writer, about himself, but the unsaid, right? What he's not saying as much as what he is saying is that the I is not as important as the we, the society. Okay, because you are a Malaysian poet. So your identity as a Malaysian poet must also showcase your sense of belonging in that society. And that is partly the mission of literature. So this is the time when art for art's sake or art for society's sake was being kind of debated. Should a work of art be to promote a kind of a social mission or a social cause, or should a work of art be just to kind of allow the individual to talk about themselves? Okay, that's something that the 21st century Malaysian writers seem to be doing more of. Like, this is what I'm interested in, right? This is what I do. And it doesn't matter if society doesn't see value in it. It doesn't matter if I don't seem to capture an aspect of the country's mindset or psyche at a particular time, but this is what interests me. So he says the self, it can be quite boring. So being indulgent on that aspect, wallowing over your own issues and concerns, is not as exciting or interesting for him as being part of a larger society and speaking on behalf of that larger society instead of speaking only about yourself. Okay, so there is that element as one grows older. So the older writers tend to be more reflective of their function and their place in society. So again, in your literature review as well as in your final project, maybe you choose a particular writer that straddles that argument between being self-indulgent and being representing or being the voice of your community or your society. That is something you may be you may have interest in. It all depends on what you are interested in as a researcher, as a reader of the corpus. I'm just exposing you to some author-defined social reality. Here's a second one. Can I get Lisa to read this for us?
Okay. Fiction is, for me, the harnessing of all human resources so that the individual writer or reader can move towards a sense of completeness. I see towards a sense of completeness because life and fiction do not have all the answers, and for both to reach completion is staticity and therefore sterility. My fiction has moved towards exploring and revealing some principle of coherence or integration that could be the basis for developing a fuller attitude towards life and the appreciation of man's manifold talents.
Okay, first question. What is the difference between Muhammad Haji Saleh's author-defined social reality and Maniam's author-defined social reality? Besides the fact that the genre is different, one is poetry, another one is prose, what is the first thing that you see as different?
I feel like K.S. Maniam has a lot more focus on individuality and perhaps selfhood.
Ruby, which particular line of phrase stands out for you for that?
The first one, I think, the harnessing of all human resources so that the individual can move towards a sense of completeness. Because a human being learns to self-actualize their potential. So instead of the individuals serving the society in Professor Muhammad's definition for KS Maniam, the society gives input to the individual to reach completeness, even though it may not happen, but yes, towards that individual development.
Okay. That, in a nutshell, is what the return is about. If you see the return, if you read the return, and you get that echoing of this statement, that's what the return is about. At least that's how I see it. The idea of coming to a sense of completeness, of understanding who you are.
Yes.
You're right in the sense that society mirrors to you what they think you are, but you get to decide. Ultimately, you get to decide in order to reach that sense of completeness.
Yes, and I also feel like as Malaysians, we do fluctuate between Prof. Muhammad's approach and KS Maniam's approach in life.
Good. Anybody else? This is my take. Anyone else?
I think I'm not sure if it's contrasting, but what stood out for me would be the from KS Maniam, right, Doctor? My fiction has moved towards exploring and revealing some principle, right? And contrasting to Prof. Muhammad Haji Saleh, like, there are limits to the individual's ability to continually interest. Yeah, so that's what stood out to me. Thank
What's
you.
the unsaid there, Shah? What's the unsaid? Try to probe that a little bit. What exactly does that indicate to you? As an individual yourself, how does that statement resonate within you? What does it say to you when you read a statement that says, my fiction has moved towards exploring and revealing some principles of coherence and integration? What does that say to you when you read that? What comes to mind? Do you like it? Do you find it a problem? Are you confused by the statement? Do you agree with it? You know what I mean? So when you read a particular statement by the author, this is not a work of fiction, mind you. This is just his essays, right? That means these are his thoughts, his personal thoughts. How do you relate to him? Can you relate to somebody like this? Or do you prefer someone like this with these statements? That's the purpose of having these author-defined social reality clearly spelled out in their own words. Now we can go to their works of fiction and we can try to explore to what extent do these statements appear in their work? To what extent does this sense of completeness of the individual is a theme or an issue in his fiction, right? Because this is what he says about his fiction. Now let's see whether it's there in his writing, in his literary works. Anyone wants to say any final thoughts about this particular quote?
Like for me, I think. Oh, Lisa, were you about to say something?
It's okay, you can go first, Amy.
Okay. Coming back to what Ruby has said and what Shah has said about the statement "my fiction," I felt that compared to Muhammad Haji Saleh, KS Maniam write based on again, it's individual and it's some sort of like based on how he sees it. But Muhammad Haji Saleh, he writes his fiction or his writing is based on what the community that he represents on is experiencing from that particular sentence, and that's how I felt about it. So because of that, I think more people will be able to relate to Muhammad Haji Saleh compared to what KS Maniam's works of writing. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Was it Lisa who wanted to say something? I can't see your faces. I'm facing the PowerPoint screen. So who wanted to say something?
It was me, Lisa.
Okay.
So this is just my 2 cents, but from what I'm getting, Muhammad Haji Saleh is kind of like a keep in touch, touch and go kind of person. How do I say this? One thing doesn't interest him for very long. To him, there's a limit of interest. When he explores, for example, a community, then he gets bored of it. That's the limit. Then he moves on to another. Whereas the letter writer, uh, to me, like she sounds like there's always something more to people than meets the eye. She probes and digs until, like she said, there's like completeness. I think she's. I don't know. I think he's someone. If I were to meet her, someone who finds the simple things in life fulfilling. So someone like that. I don't know. I kind of get that vibe from what she writes. But yeah, someone like that. Someone who thinks like people reading newspapers or how they pour their cups of tea, how they have their breakfast. Yeah, someone like that finds things like that interesting. Yeah, I think I don't know.
Let's see if you agree. Let's see with your if you agree with your hypothesis about the writer, about K.S. Maniam, when you read his novel, right? So these are hypotheses that we form. This is partly the technique when you're reading a writer for the first time. Don't go straight into the reading. I mean, unless you're reading for pleasure, I'm not expecting you to read criticisms and all the rest of it. But criticisms, essays actually help create a kind of a backdrop or a context to the writings that you are reading. Not just the summary, not just the other people's opinions, reviews about it, but also these kinds of statements, because they are the lens from which the author creates his worldview as a literary writer. So these statements that you are forming about the writer's statements himself, right? His own statements as a writer helps inform you as a reader. So do consider them seriously when you're reading the return, and then ask yourself, to what extent is the central character Ravi very much an embodiment of this element of the individual moving towards a sense of completeness? Finally, Lloyd Fernando. Can I get Ruby to read this for me?
Okay, Doctor.
And he was also a trained lawyer. So just want to make that connection.
Okay. All right. All good writers seek to rediscover what the Thucydides called the stump of our feeling, the native pith which could rearm them for the task of taking the jangling heterogeneity of the modern world in their stride. The discipline of seeking to most oneself is the fundamental basis of cultural growth, and writers in post-colonial societies especially have realized that it is that basis which has become obscured and in some cases even scorched by centuries of foreign domination. The attempt to retrieve the essentials of a native past, far from being retrogressive, is vitally necessary, and the talented writer who sets out to rediscover the strength of his own linguistic heritage puts first things first, in wanting to know himself more truly, to balance what he knows of others.
Okay. Let's compare between Maniam, Prof. Muhammad Haji Saleh, and Lloyd Fernando. What is Lloyd Fernando's author-defined social reality based on?
Oh, I'm actually surprised by this passage. I feel like it is more weighty and bulky. I think he inserted a somewhat historical context to a writer's social reality, which is very different from K.S. Maniam. Because I was thinking just now, I thought perhaps K.S. Maniam and Prof. Muhammad's, they differ because of their different position in society. Because K.S. Maniam belongs to the minority and Prof. Muhammad majority. But looking at Lloyd Fernando, it's a different sort of call of duty trace your linguistic heritage, he does locate himself within that framework that I feel is closer to Prof. Muhammad. Yeah, so that's my thought.
Anybody else? This is my key phrases. Just to kind of just to let you know, all three men were professors of literature at the university. Prof. Muhammad was with UKM. Lloyd Fernando and K.S. Maniam were with University Malaya until they retired. And then Lloyd Fernando later on went on to do his law degree and set up his own firm after that, after retirement, before passing away. K.S. Maniam passed away last year. Mel, was it last year?
Yeah, last year I think K.S. Maniam passed away last year.
Last year or 2 years ago? Yeah. Last year.
Last year, I think during COVID. Yeah. Yeah, but Prof. Muhammad Haji Saleh has attended some of our programs, so you all might have met him, So, final thoughts about this particular statement by Lloyd Fernando about what is a good writer, or what's the definition of a good writer? Is it too philosophical, you think?
To me, it's like a bridge. Not a bridge. Like if you can put like K.S. Mania on the right, and then Prof. Muhammad Jisali on the left, and then Lloyd Fernando would be like in the middle. Like he finally, because of the last I think it's because of the last sentence, the attempt to retrieve the essential of native past, and then it's necessary to set out and rediscover the strength of his own linguist. I'm still processing though, but I'm just saying what I feel right now.
No,
Yeah.
Shah, if you had met the man, that's exactly spot on, because he is very much like that. He's a Sinhalese by background, yeah, his ethnicity, but his novels, both his novels, try to kind of create a more multicultural landscape rather than writing from a particular ethnic community or for a particular ethnic community. He has the Malay characters, the Indian characters, the Chinese characters, the Eurasian characters. He tries to kind of forge that, but critics feel that this is too artificial. But that's spot on. What you were saying about the bridge aspect, that's very much his personality as a writer. That's very much his author-defined social reality in his novels. So very astute, spot on. Anyone else?
Thank you, Doctor.
I'm sorry, Roy, but I wonder what it means, retrieve the essentials of a native past. What if we don't have the ability to retrieve them? So I find that sentence very, yeah.
More importantly, what if you're not part of the native past? What if you are part of the migrant past? Because Fernando is a migrant, right, from the migrant community, yet he's talking about a native past. So it's almost like echoing a kind of a nationalist stance, And that's what he does in his first novel, Scorpion Orchid. He uses the Malay annals, Sejarah Melayu, as a kind of a backdrop to every episode in his in the novel. And in Green is the Color, he uses he uses another element of Malaysian history. So not the May 69 riot, that is the context, but I will let you all know next week. But basically he does that. He uses an element of the folklore or the Malaysian the Malayan literary psyche and incorporates that in his own writing and tries to forge a Malaysian novel. He tries to do that. Anybody else final thoughts about this particular statement by this particular writer? He's in fact one of my favorite writers, not because of his writing necessarily, but because of his personality. He was such a beautiful man, know?
To be honest, when you said that he's a lawyer, and I'm like, no wonder he writes like this. That was my first. I'm like, oh my god. It's like,
Right, but he is such a sweetheart, you know, without being condescending, compared to KS Maniam, who's very standoffish. When we met him the first time in 1995, we set up there was a workshop at British Council. We had various Malaysian writers, but Fernando was such a lovely personality. He sat with everybody, he spoke with everybody. KS Maniam had he's very much an introvert, you know.
Recluse, yeah.
Very much a recluse. So the idea of harnessing all human resources towards understanding the sense of completeness in the individual, to me, it's like, oh my God, that's exactly what he is like, you know. And Ravi in his first novel, Rajan in his second novel, both problematize this theme of what does it mean to be a complete human being. You know, what am I searching for? How do I bring closure to all the issues in my life? You know, where else?
You guys have read the Haunting the Tiger? I know Amy has.
I was thinking of when Doctor mentioned about Ravi, the main character finding themselves in the Haunting of the Tiger, Haunting Tiger.
Mutu.
Haunting the Tiger.
Yeah, Mutu is also finding himself, like whether he's considering whether he's a Malaysian or whether Malayan, or he was like from the first generation community, so he's like debating that. So yeah.
That Haunting the Tiger is a short story which later became a full novel called In a Far Country. That was his second novel.
I didn't know that. I should
Yeah,
go and find that.
so the kind of conflict that Mutu experiences in Haunting the Tiger, Rajan experiences it in a full scale, and Maniam writes the novel in a kind of a stream of consciousness, which sometimes it's difficult to understand because the character goes into his own dream state and has a kind of a conversation with himself and challenges things, and so yeah, it was a very different style of writing, but that's exactly the issue that he deals with in In a Far Country, his second novel.
If I could just mention about in Shopee, there is a KS Maniam collection for just 63 ringgit, all 3 books.
In where?
Shopee.
Oh my
I
God.
was on Shopee just now to look for.
Yeah, so there's the Return in a Far Country and the collection of stories and plays Sensuous Horizons. It's 63 ringgit only for those 3 books.
Oh my God, what
Yeah.
a treasure.
in our group, if you don't mind. Do you have
Sorry?
it?
Can you share the link, Mel?
Okay.
Product. People will be so weird. Why are we sharing Shopee links?
I hope that there's enough for all of us to order. Let me check.
That would be great if we can get. Okay, finally, so the issues to ponder upon, you know, we've only shared 3 case studies of 3 Malaysian writers from the 20th century, mind you. You know, these are not present century writers. Maniam has passed on, Fernando has passed on, but Muhammad Gisali still writes. But questions to ask ourselves is, what is their author-defined social reality based on? Is there any sense of coherence between the different Malaysian writers' sense of function and writer? Do they have any coherence in terms of, is there any point of convergence between the 3 of them, or are they each having their own separate sense of social reality as an author? And then when you probe new writers, when you look at emerging writers, you can ask that same question. Are any of their opinions being shared by current writers, emerging writers? You know? And what about the readers? Are these opinions shared by Malaysian readers, by readers generally? You know, maybe there are those of you, I mean, I will say this, when I first read The Return, I couldn't get to it, I couldn't understand it. But when I started to study it and I understood that theme of reaching a sense of completeness, I could get to it because I was struggling with that as well in my early 20s. I was going through that kind of a challenge. So I didn't look at, the first time I read The Return, I felt like I have no idea what this is about. This is not about me. This is, it's set in the estates in Bedong Kedah up north, and I've never experienced that. But when I shared my own preconceived notions and I kind of said, look, this is a story about one individual boy and his struggle to find his sense of identity, then I could relate to it. Then I could say, okay, that's the kind of thing that I was going through too in my 20s, So that's what I mean by saying keep an open mind when you're reading Malaysian writers. The name of the characters might not be members of your ethnic communities. It might be a male character instead of a female. It might be a member of a Chinese community if you're from Malay community, or an Indian community if you're from the Malay community, or in Salim's case, a Malaysian, not even in Kurd, right? But keep an open mind and always ask yourself, what is this story about? What is the theme? What's the story about? And how does it speak to me as a reader, as a student of literature? Finally, tutorial task for next week. This is what you need to do. This is your first e-task, which you will share with us next week during class. First of all, you need to read the novel, The Return. Secondly, identify the settings in the story, meaning what are the different settings in the story? It's not set in a house. It's not set in one location. It moves from one location to another. So I want you to kind of track the settings. That's what I mean. The third is identify how each setting reflects the context of Malaya at that time. And finally, what do you feel Maniam was trying to do or trying to attempt to do through this novel? Keeping in mind the statement that he made and that we explored. Okay, so this is basically the tutorial task is basically your first impression of this novel. Then the following week, when we look at essays by other scholars on Maniam, on his novels, you can make comparisons with other people's impressions of Maniam and his novel, The Return. All right? Questions? Okay, I'm done for the lecture. Any questions?
Doctor.
Yeah.
I tried to find the novel written from the website that you posted in the website in WhatsApp group, but I couldn't find it.
Oh.
Yeah. So I was wondering if anyone has.
I have the digital copy.
Okay.
Just a second,
Okay.
Because I got the digital copy from that website.
Oh, really? I tried to find it, but it wasn't there.
Anyone else found it?
Google it as well. I tried also at the BOK library.
It wasn't there?
Yeah, I tried to find it there and also everywhere online, but I couldn't find it.
Okay.
Oh, Salim, you have it.
Sorry?
Salim has it, I think. I mean, the physical copy, sorry.
He does?
He was showing.
Wow.
Show me? Wow.
Did you order it, Salim? You're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry for that. I do believe that at the beginning of my first semester, I tried to get something like that, and I don't know. Then I postponed my first semester, and then I do believe that for you or you are, yes, I'm sure you posted on the WhatsApp, but the problem that I postponed that course. Yes, doctor. Thank you.
Now I have to look for it.
Yeah.
I will find it.
Inshallah, if I have, I do believe that I have the copy. I'm gonna post it on the WhatsApp group. Inshallah.
Okay, brilliant.
Thank you,
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Salim. But I have the digital copy, and I will share that by today, inshallah, so that you all can start reading it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elia, for that. Any other questions?
Doctor, the discussion about the book would be done orally next week, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I will start with a lecture like today, and then we will go into the discussion, your thoughts, your preliminary thoughts. With every text that we are studying, I want you to kind of explore the unsaid. What is it that others are saying about this text? What is it that I am seeing in this text? You know, so one of the things that I saw in the return was a story about the tension between the individual and his community. The individual is a coming of age story of a young boy, right? So Bildungsroman is a coming of age story of a young boy trying to understand where he fits in that bigger scheme of things, and also asking himself, can I dictate my own destiny, or is that already set for me? So that's what I saw. But I would like to know your take. What did you see when what do you see when you're reading this text? Maybe it's not Ravi that catches your attention. Maybe it's the mother. Maybe it's the father character. Maybe it's the grandmother character. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be the central protagonist. You might have a different take on it. Right? So yeah. Okay. Mel, do you want to say anything to kind of finish up today's class?
No, I've just been enjoying hearing everybody's thoughts. It's so interesting. So thank you. It's a big change for me after the undergrad. So always just look at you. So yeah, this has been so engaging. I've been really enjoying myself. Thank you so much, Dr.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I appreciate Dr. Mel's she's like the repertoire. Like I give a lecture, and then after that she kind of unpacks certain things and break it down. So I'm really appreciating, because this is the first time I'm team teaching for this particular course. So it's kind of fun to have that kind of feedbacks and observation. So I really appreciate that, Dr. Mel. Thank you. So so thank you so much, everybody. I know it was a very long session. But keep in mind, week 11, no more class, so to like hold it together for the first 10 weeks and say, oh my God.
I was really shocked that today's class is very rich.
Right, because I go straight into it.
Yeah, I think all of us really like, wow.
Yeah, and I think once you get the gist of it, it'll be fun. The engagement of the text will be a lot more fun. So next week will be more engagement with the text. Yeah. So okay. So thank you so much, everybody. I will see you next week, and I will try to share the digital copy as soon as I can find them.
Am I seeing you tomorrow for critical appreciation?
Yes. I'm seeing. Who am I seeing? I'm seeing
me. I think Shah also.
I'm seeing Rubisha and Dong Lai.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Rai, is there going to be a Google Classroom for this?
Yes, I will be setting up a Google Classroom. I haven't had the time. I will do that soon. But just read the novel first, okay? Yeah. And Ruby, Shah, I will see you all tomorrow. Okay.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everybody. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Doctor, thank you so much.
Thank
you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.